Recording
So
in
it would have a
progress.
number of design aspects we would be checking mainly. How do you design a project and so on. So anyway, instead of getting ahead of ourselves, let's go to the lesson plan a little bit. So first part of the course, I will be delivering mainly the mainly the introduction to object-oriented programming concepts, right? So, and there are a couple of other things we would be covering about, I mean, how do you do the graphical user interfaces and so on. Mainly the program, the course module is based on Java. Of course, you all have learned the Python basically programming relatively well. And this one we will be focusing on actually getting through the concepts of object-oriented programming. So you might not completely get all the, maybe not all the exercises you might want through the course module content itself. So, but there are tools and there are various opportunities for you to go and practice various different skills you are learning, concepts you are learning, polish yourselves, right? So you'll try to improve the course content, such like maybe exercise collections and so on. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So yeah, the first part is essentially Java-based object-oriented programming. Beyond that, you would learn the software engineering process essentially. That means that when you are developing a program, it is like, of course, now when you are doing Python, you will sit in front of computer, program it, execute it, and you get the results, and you are happy. But in a enterprise environment, it's not like that, right? You have a large number of different stakeholders in the play, and there are a lot of money involved as well in certain cases, and there are a lot of critical processes involved, right? There are certain business processes or various types of processes involved. So so it also does not stay constantly and statically, right? Everything is dynamic, so there are things changing, there are requirements you need to understand, and there are like very complicated requirements coming up, right? So how do you understand them properly before building a software? Then starting from there, even at the conception of you need a program, right, or software, from that process onwards, actually up to the deployment, commissioning, debugging, and change management to decommissioning whatever the system. So there is a software development life cycle, right? So you will be learning about them, and your project would also reflect some of the aspects of such a project. Okay, so yeah, so the lectures would be by for this software engineering part would be by Professor Indika. So he would take the second part. Okay. Meanwhile, you will do in the second part of the semester, you would do the project as well parallelly with the lectures. Okay. All right. So okay, regarding the logistics now, lecture would be at this time for the foreseeable, relatively every day, right? So, but for the mid-semester exam, you would have to find the lab, and you would have to come physically and do the lab at the do the mid-semester examination at the lab. Okay. But for other days, the lab should be available. Even for today, I think the lab is reserved for you guys. So you should be able to be at the lab if you want to actually come and use the lab. If you don't have a laptop, you can still come to the department and find a place to sit and join the lecture. Okay. But for the practicals, I heard that there is a concern about the timetables. So we were thinking of moving it to maybe Wednesday 3:15. Is it a good time, or is it, I don't know whether there is anybody from electronics here. If it is the case, we can move it to Wednesday would be the ideal case for me. But if there is a concern about that, Wednesday 3:15, please let me know. Otherwise, we will conduct the session that's also online, and I would just go through some of the things, and maybe I will set the deadline also flexibly. So you can do it asynchronously as well if you like. But yeah, so I will be discussing and maybe giving some tips on how to do this thing uh, in the practical time slot as well. And you can bring in any questions, and so it's mainly flexible. But that particular time slot I introduce in the lab, I would do it on Wednesday. Can somebody from electronics check and let me know whether the Tuesday is the Wednesday is all right for you?
Yes, sir. We are available on Wednesday.
Wednesday 3:30. Okay, sorry, 3:15. So yeah, let's do that way then. So any contact person I can now, who should I contact if I mean I need some representative to do the coordination if there is any message need to be passed. Can you send some maybe mobile number? Okay.
Yes,
So
sir.
okay, Lakindu, right? Okay. All right. From electrical, I think I got some contact already. Mm, yeah, I think I should be fine. I'll find the contact. Yeah, all right. Okay. So, any questions to resolve before moving on to the course content? Another thing is like usually the projects you would be doing, you some of them you could do it in the essentially the Moodle itself. So there is a CodeRunner plugin which we'll be using. So yeah, practicals are also, I mean, it would be, I will just give some instructions online and you would have to do it by yourself. And a lot of them are, I mean, exercises for you to try out. Okay. So essentially, I mean, there will be some files. It is about mainly understanding the concepts using, trying them out. So yeah, so you can do it by yourself as well. But if you join the session at the time, I would give some guideline, and if there's a specific thing I would be giving maybe a graded exercise, I would give maybe some yeah. So I will notify you that okay. So I will be giving a specific quiz or something during that day. Okay. Otherwise, it is just usually, I mean, yeah, so there will be some asynchronous activities. I will give you one today, and like that, like very simple activities going forward, and attempt to them, and essentially, yeah, so it will be recorded in the Moodle. All right. So the deadlines usually keep track of the deadlines, even though the practical session is at that day, I won't give the deadline exactly there. So we would have a couple of days to finish probably. So it's flexible. But yeah, so you have to understand the concepts. That's the entire idea of doing the practicals, and you would be tested mainly in the final project and also the final exam for that matter. Okay. All right. So all right. So the NetBeans IDE you need to install. If I hope all of you have a laptop or where you can work. So will be I mean it is recommended to use NetBeans, but you can use something like Eclipse or whatever the VS Code, whatever the thing you are comfortable with. So NetBeans IDE, Apache NetBeans IDE 24 is the recent one, so you can use it. It has number of different options, debugging and everything is very friendly with Java. So you would be using that. and yeah, so a couple of other things also. So yeah, get it ready, and yeah, so there are a couple of exercises actually I can make it available to you now. So all right, I need to change the entire okay, I will give this one later on next week probably. Yeah, one recording also if you want to refer. Anyway, all right. So this one you can try essentially download, and I mean nothing much, but just upload it for the record, and yeah, so and kind of a like a activity for your attendance. Okay. All right. All right. So let's move on to the content. So the first topic is essentially like so there are it is labeled one. Okay. So I mean now you have done a lot of programming with Python, so you know various I mean basics of doing programming, right? So what is modular software development? Why do we need like modularity? What do we lack in Python? I mean in Python also there is object oriented programming you have done already, right? So any idea like what are we like? Of course, in a programming language, when you are defining the programming language, you uh, define what are the essentially. I mean, maybe the set of keywords are there, right? Then there are ways of defining certain variables, right? And constants, and also how do you refer to various different libraries, right? Or whatever the existing code bases. So yeah, so you go through a couple of I mean basic ideas, and I mean let's see like what do we mean by I mean in modular software development, the major idea is that what we call the object oriented programming, right? So there are objects. I mean we consider some things as objects. We come into that later on, but data types were the ones which you're already familiar with, right? There are things called data types, right? Where you can hold on to various different maybe data which are coming through in various dynamic instances, right? Or dynamic manner. So there are like for example, integer value, you know how to store it, right? And so on. So how to deal with it, right? So these are called primitive types, right? These are primitive types where we would have um, essentially rigid structure of the data type is known, and it is well established, and it is not supposed to be changed by us, right? It is defined by the language itself, so that it can be used by easy means, right? The long boolean double, right? There are characters, right? So these are kind of primitives, right? So now the question is, let's say we want to have something little bit complex, right? So let's say I need to represent a person, or represent a certain, let's say a coordinate, for example, right? There are two values supposed to be there, x and y, or maybe x, y, z, right? So now how would you combine these things together to actually build a complex concepts or a concept type, right? Complex type, right? So that's what we are looking at, and that's what we are thinking. But again, like it should be there should be a certain set of like uh, methodology how to do that, right? And your language should support that as well. So I mean of course you have worked with, for example, arrays, right? So if you have an array, you know how to do a single dimensional array, one dimensional, two dimensional, three dimensional, and so on. And then you can access them in a particular way by easily referring to, and I mean based on the language you are using, right? Based on the syntax you are using, right? But if the object is a little bit more complex, right? If it has a multiple different various different aspects you can look into in this, or you can find in these set of kind of objects, right? We need to have a way of knowing that, right? So simple one would be a string, right? So a string is an array essentially, right? But what are the differences? Now, why don't you keep an array I mean a sequence of characters essentially, right? Instead of keeping it as an string. What is the difference if you have a character array, and how can a string differ from having a character array? Can somebody tell me? I mean, you have an array and array of characters, right? Whatever the number of characters. And what makes it different from a string, from an string object? I need some answers. You can use the chat if you like, or you can use just talk. Strings are immutable. Okay. Good. In yeah, it's okay. Yeah, correct. All right. What else? Other answers? Storing data type. All right. I mean, okay, so data type. The first thing is, let's say a character array, right? Now this is a variable, right? Ultimately, we want to make it make it a variable, right? So the problem is now, if it is a character array, like how do you make sure that, let's say there is a like a word we need to put in this one, a string we need to actually put in here, right? Let's say cat, right? A cat. We put it here, right? Now in another time it could appear as maybe wolf, right? Right, so there could be various different things coming up, right? But now how do you interpret it? I mean, what happens with the remaining space, right? If it is a variable, it's also related to the memory management essentially, right? So how much space we are going to keep for this particular array, right? That's the first thing. What is the length of the array, right? So whenever a new string sequence of characters comes in, if it is not enough, what you are going to do next, right? So I mean, there are certain like kind of a management situation we have to do here, right? It is not just storing the data and referring to them, but we should be able to handle certain different concerns, right? In the characters, usually character array, you would put something like /n here, for example, right? Then it would know that, okay, so it is going to be terminated here, and the remainder would be discarded, right? But if it is an array without any memory or a buffer overflow safety, it might probably trim it here, right? So if you want to actually store it, if you, I mean, you are storing a lengthy word here and it might overflow, right? So this is not memory safe, first of all, right? So another option is that, okay, so if you are keeping it as a variable in a memory allocated, a dedicated set of memory locations, it could be leading to certain problems. Another problem is you can allocate, I mean, another option is that you can allocate unreasonably large amount of memory so that it won't get any problem, get into many problem. But again, you can overflow that as well, right? So the type safety, when you are defining types, how safe the types are, right, is important, right? Another thing is like, let's say you have a variable like a long and double, right? So, or maybe long and int, or a float and a double, right? So these things, like sometimes you should be able to interchangeably put a value, right? I mean, you can define an integer variable and put a value. And maybe if it is a larger number, maybe you can use a long variable, right? If the floating point value is there, if you are copying a floating point value to a decimal or double variable, right? A float variable to a double variable, how could it convert well, right? So these kind of things are already existing and they are taken care within the programming languages, right? But the problem is when you actually go for a little bit more complicated things like strings, right? Can you, for example, let's say there are a string A and string B. If you just say A plus B now, what would happen? Anybody? We need to do a certain complex things with these objects, right? Or these kind of things. So maybe you want to do A plus B, it could mean various things, right? Sometimes it could be whether just checking whether A equals B, right? Now, if it is asked as a question, right, how would you execute that? Now, bit by bit comparison would be a good way to go, but would it be sufficient, right? Then as the right? So as you said, it is probably immutable. That means that, I mean, when you actually using it, right? We have, I mean, now all of these complexities about implementations probably are not that much important to a programmer, right? As far as it is type safe and as far as it is handled underneath without any corruption, so like maybe buffer overflows or any kind of things, we will be happy to just be able to do these kind of things, right? I mean, if we can define what A equals B means, we don't mind whether it's I mean, let's say it's two different objects like dogs or cats or even whatever the thing, right? As far as we can define what is the meaning of A equals B, and whether we can say it is the same object or not, right? So it's good for us, right? So I mean, let's say in the strings, right? If you do A plus B, maybe it is a concatenation operation, right? You append the second word B into the first word, and we need a appended version of the variable, right? So essentially what we are doing is from the user's or the programmer's perspective, we are trying to simplify things, right? Based on certain abstractions, right? So you should define it, then you can use it flexibly, right? So I mean, now how do you implement it is again like maybe a under the cover story, right? So immutability, for example, right? If you want to be, what does it mean by immutable? Essentially, the idea is that if you actually try to declare a variable, or I mean, then populate it, essentially it would be I mean, it would probably allocate its own memory and actually build the thing by itself, right? So then whenever you want to change it, right? When you are going to replace the variable, instead of changing the same thing, you would have a different place and a different memory allocation for that. Then you would again do whatever the appended thing would be. Again, maybe the first part of the A would be copied to here, then the B would be copied to the remaining memory, right? You know how much memory you need now, right? Then what you would do is, okay, so this one is allocated to, let's say, A, right? You need to put this one into A. Then what you do is, like, essentially you would point the variable name A to the new location, okay, instead of this one, right? So it is again related to how the memory management is done, right? So you can't essentially change once you do it, right? So anyway, so the objects, again, coming back to our main story, the objects are something which we can define, and then we can use it, reuse it, refine it along the way, right? That's the idea. So those are not uh, rigid as some of these primitive types. I mean, these are supposed to be rigid, right? Otherwise, everything can't be interpreted. But now, based on that, you would give a lot of flexibility to handle complex objects, complex concepts, and then use them to combine various operations, right? A typical example would be a data structures and algorithms, right? So you have done some maybe a sorting task or a searching task, right? So now when you are building the thing, right, when you want to build a search algorithm or a sort algorithm, right, you don't know exactly what you are searching, right, or sorting. It could be books, it could be maybe a people based on their heights or whatever, right? But then you should be still able to write a sorting algorithm in an abstract manner, right? So this is why there are we will talk about them in length later on, but this is why it is important to be able to abstract certain concepts and then use them in various ways, right? So, all right. So you can essentially define new objects types. You can't define new primitives, but you can define new object types, right? So yeah, so that's the idea. So what is the process of it? We will learn, and how to define a good, I mean, reasonable object, right? So declaration of types, right? Like you said, when you want a variable integer, you give the type, then the name and the value, right? If you just like initialize it here and there, right? But for objects, you need to say what is the type of the object, then the name of the variable, then of course there's a keyword called new, and then you would put a again a constructor. We call this string parenthesis a constructor. Then maybe also you can initialize that particular object with a certain input or even parameters sometimes, right? So you will learn it I mean, in practice, okay? Yeah, so there are certain conventions not to confuse these things, right? These are conventions, not again hard and fast rules or things, but yeah, usually the variable names are starting with a simple letter. Variable types or like classes would start with a capital letter, okay? Primitive types also start with a simple letter. Would keep it like that for easy, but I mean, now there are objects, for example, for integer as well. So there is an object called integer. Then what should it start from? It should start from capital I, right? Because it's an object, right? So there are various requirements for some things like that. But if it's a primitive, usually we keep it as int is a primitive, so I would keep it as a simple I and so on. Right? And these are by convention, right? Not the hard and fast rules, but yeah. So yeah, object type names should always have, yeah. So yeah, object types, the class names are, I mean, we call them a class, right? Based on the class template, you would build an object. That's what we are doing. Okay. So again, typing, static typing and dynamic typing. What does that mean? So I said that declaring our own variables, one advantage is that we can define certain functions which can operate on these type of objects, right? So we call them, I mean, we will be coming to an object-oriented paradigm in a while, but I mean, obvious thing is that when you are trying to add two things up, probably they are not compatible with each other, right? So now if you are actually writing a program, how would you know that it is going to work or not, right? So I mean, if your variables are strongly typed, or if you say that, okay, so it must be kept into this type, right? If it is in n is an integer, it must be an integer, right? So if you try to add a let's say a string to this particular integer, right? So what will happen? So it is probably, I mean, there are two places where you might find this can be fixed, right? So one is that at the compile time itself, right? Even before actually like executing the program, your compiler would see that, okay, so there is a chance that you might receive a string into this particular place, and you should not allow that, right? Let's say this is a different variable which is not, which has a different type, maybe common type, whatever the thing, right? So it should not happen, right? But other thing is maybe in runtime, right? Sometimes you cannot know what is the type which is going to be coming into this particular variable or the location in advance. So then it would be dynamically at the runtime, it might lead to a crash of the program, right? Because I mean, sometimes it won't crash, but it would corrupt the data, right? So there are those two alternatives which might happen, right? So yeah, so static typing means that at the compile time we are fixing and saying that, okay, so it cannot, we are ensuring that it cannot ever receive different types, but it also limits our flexibility of having a little bit some, I mean, sometimes it is possible to do this kind of thing, right? Let's say this was a string, right? Then a string, adding a string to a number and allocating it to a string, right? That probably maybe is just an append again, right? Maybe adding a floating point value to integer, right? So that would lead to a floating point value, right? So some things can be done even the type is not the same, right? So the idea is that if you are doing a static typing, it would have a set of rules that which knows that, okay, so these are allowed and these are not allowed, and it would carefully look for those, right? But dynamic typing are more flexible, but it might lead to a runtime error, crashing your program down the line or corrupt the data without noticing it, right? But it would actually, it can notice at the runtime, right? When it is executing, maybe it would say an exception. I mean, by identifying that it is a different type, maybe it would say that, okay, so it is performing this is warning, I mean, maybe risky, so I won't do it and I will stop the program here, right? Like that, right? Execution flow might be interrupt a bit. It does not, because it does not know sometime whether this operation, how to do that. We have not defined it sometimes, right? All right. So in Python, right? So if you try to do this, it wouldn't complain it until it reaches the line that is in the program while it is running, right? It would crash it suddenly. Until that, you won't know that it is a problem at all, right? It would execute until that point without a problem. Sometimes some line of codes, right? In the programs you are writing, let's say there are 10,000 lines of code, right? In a specific combination of inputs in specific context, only it would get this kind of a specialized value, right? Or maybe a different type of variable there, right? So I mean, while debugging, you might not know that, right? So that's a kind of a problem in certain cases. And if you want to ensure that our programs are running without any problem at the runtime, which will be deployed and probably operationalized in a certain enterprise, right? So you can't run into such problems. It would be problematic, right? So This is why usually Java has static typing. So unlike Python, so it would give a compile time error so that you can fix it as a developer, not as an executor who will be just using the system, right? So usually this is why Python is used mainly by the maybe somebody who is doing programs, right, at the moment. But Java is typically after deployment, maybe the programs would run for 15 years without any interruption or involvement from a active developers, right? Unless there are change requests and bug fixes and whatnot, of course, right? So, but yeah. So anyway, so strings as an example of objects, right? So if you just try to add it, it would append, right? It would concatenate rather than adding the numerical values, right? So, but then again, as you said, right, string objects are immutable. But if you have a variable and if you are trying to allocate a value to that or new string to the same variable, you'd essentially replace your memory allocated memory and the entire thing, right? So then there is a process called garbage collection, right? Search for it, it's garbage collection, right? Let's say there is a string you have allocated memory to, and then you appended another string to that one, and then you have updated apparently this particular variable, right? So what happened to the previous memory allocated for that and the first string you have had there, right? So usually at the programmer's flow or when you're executing, you don't see what happened to that particular old memory allocation for this variable, right? So it is actually the duty of the maybe Java JVM or like whatever the execution environment to figure out the variables which have lost all the pointers, right? It is not being pointed by any of the references, then it would consider it as garbage and it would take it out as garbage collection, right? So then you would reuse that particular memory allocation for other variables and other data, right? All right. So now immutability is something you can do, right? So, but again, the major thing is that there are various different things now we can probe about this particular variable, right? So it is not just keeping a quantity, it can do certain things, right? We can ask questions from it, like what is the length, right? I mean, now if it is done using a certain character string, then I mean, you have to iterate through each of the characters and find where the /n is, right? End of the string. But maybe, I mean, everybody can't write such I mean, complex programs to just for the sake of finding this particular property, so you should be able to implement it once and reuse multiple times, right? So this is why we call them behaviors, repeated behaviors, right? So strings have certain behaviors that you can call upon and ask what it is, right? And if it is reporting, then we'll be very happy, right? So we don't need to calculate ourselves as programmers. So we can ask certain questions from this particular thing, right? The idea is instead of implementing each and every such like typically all the time reoccurring functionalities into the our own program, right? Instead of repeating the entire like a large code bases, why don't you delegate? In the object-oriented programming, modular programming, the major idea is delegation, right? Instead of doing ourselves, we delegate. Okay, so you calculate and tell me what is doing, what is the value, right? Give me the result, not the method. I don't know method. You give the method and get things done and then report back, right? So that's the mentality we are looking at in doing doing the object-oriented programming. Okay. So, all right. Sequence length. Yeah. So it could be like, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, for example, extracting substring, right? You would write a, I mean, a complex library of things to actually do this, but a set of functions as library would be fine, right? That's what you have done in Python, right? So you have a set of libraries which are capable of handling string functions, right? So then you would use it in your variable, right? That's the typical maybe functional programming, not functional, but procedural programming, as we call it, right? This is the nature we do, right? We have a set of procedures stored somewhere which knows how to process the string variable. Then you would get that procedures calls when you actually want to get things done. It would be like we have a function called length, and you would give the sequence into the function as an argument, and you would get the length instead of length in return, right? So that's something you could do, but the problem is now that library. I mean, if you want to update something, it is not coupled tightly, right? It's not a nature of the variable. Remind that we are targeting a big and complex objects. String is the smallest example, right? There could be 1,000 or 10,000 different types of objects around us, right? So now for each type of them, we can't build a separate library of functions, right? So this is why we are combining, or we are trying to associate all these functionalities into the object itself as its behavior, right? Once the behavior is bound to the data, right? So it becomes an object which can actually which we can actually probe. We can just asking the object itself, what is your thing, right? So then it would tell us, and we would be very happy to use it, right? It would be, there are 10,000 types of objects. We would still deal with them as objects, because each objects know about themselves rather than we manually keeping index and all the behaviors about each one of these objects, right? All right. So yeah, you can go and learn the string objects and how they are working in Java. But yeah, so this would be a very simple program you might run, right? So there are two strings, and you would just append some of these things and do a string formatting, and you would get an output, right? So there are like a typical structure for the Java programs. It would start with public static void main. So this is the typically an entry point to the any of the Python Java programs, right? So there must be a main program, main function, which would be triggered at the beginning of as a entry point to our program, right? So these words terminology we will learn in a subsequently. So yeah, so then there are a set of arguments you can pass, right? So then yeah, technically this should be capital string, right? So then there is another function. Now this is a function probably, but it is also, there are a number of different dots you can find, right? So what happens with these dots? So even though it is like as a single, instead of it's a single function, you can see that, we call them actually in Java or in any object-oriented programming context, is a method, right? Now, how it becomes a method? So it is a method of what we call a system.out class, right? So there are static classes and instance classes and so on. But now there is a system, right? In the entire, wherever the system which is this particular program is running, right? So there is output handling a certain, again, another property of that particular system, right? Out of them, again, the println is the method essentially, which is a part of our out property of the system object, or a system class or a static object. It could be a static object, right? So yeah, so now the idea is that once you write it, so maybe the program is executed in a mobile phone or a maybe a Linux machine or a AMD machine or a Intel machine, whatever the thing, right? Apple Mac, still it would run without a problem, because how to handle all the underneath this, what is the system, what's its behavior, how is it implementing that thing, is not up to us, right? We don't need to know that, as far as this one is going to be reflected in the screen, right? So this is how the object oriented programming essentially works, right? So yeah, so it gives portability and being able to upgrade, update, and maybe do various things, right? So all right, any questions? Okay, the sequence length is equals 3 if sequence is try out, right? So how do you try out? Okay, so I won't tell you much. You have to try out. Try out, you would know. So in this particular example, your first Java program, so it's just a hello world thing you can try, right? So how to do the instruction is available. The deadline, yeah, I would set the deadline. Actually, I didn't set the deadline yet, so I would set the deadline. So you can install Java, NetBeans IDE. I mean, find a new version. It's totally fine. Okay, so yeah, so setting up the project, and I mean, this is an ultimately very simple thing, couple of things, but you would find and then try out some of the string operations, for example, right? And also this has a part of GUI which you can try out. So this one we will go through in the actually the practical time slot, maybe next Wednesday as we discussed. Okay, so yeah, don't worry too much for now, but yeah, can follow through and try. And also another example we would do is, okay, so yeah, so for this week let's go a little bit flexibly, don't worry. Okay, all right, so any questions? Okay, so again, now let's look at again a familiar concept, arrays, right? So in I mean, now this is basically we are comparing against C language. It is in C languages it could be, I mean, somewhat complicated how you handle some of the things and get access to a certain point of data, right? But in Python it's I mean, abstracted in a way that you can just put a double colon and slice through any of the multi-dimensional arrays, right? So that's fascinating. But I mean, if it is just a fixed length sequence of values, right? So now the arrays are mainly the concept of array. Array is a collection, right? Collection of things. But now, how can you? I mean, if it is just a set of integers, it could be a simple sequence of whatever the type, right? If it is integers, right? Integer array would be a simple thing to do, right? Because you know the size of the integer, for example, right? How many bytes are necessary for the integer. But you actually have a string. Now, string array is what, right? So this is why, like, I mean, as we said, it is a kind of a immutable object as well. So we essentially have to keep a set of pointers to wherever the things are stored, right? It's not a contiguous a set of memory locations, right? Usually we define array as a continuous set of memory locations, but probably the data are not stored like that anymore, right? When it is complex thing like a string or even maybe whatever the other type of variables, right? It essentially maybe there are some of these objects which are stored in the array, would have various different sizes, right? So maybe, I mean, they would be stored in different places, but you are pointing to each one of them as necessary, right? But if it is a double, maybe a two-dimensional array, how is it, right? So these called array of arrays, right? So again, yeah, it is instead of, I mean, just a two-dimensional memory allocation, it is array of arrays. That means array of essentially a collection of pointers again, right? Collection of pointers to a collection of different pointers, right? So yeah. So, yeah, it can be considered as an object, right? But now here you can see like carefully, like now if you are using this particular notation, right? This notation, it is a primitive array, right? Right. But here you can see that, okay, so string array also can be done, right? Yeah, sorry, maybe I confused it. So yeah, so array can be any type of object can be put into an array, right? So idea is that now if there is a certain different types of objects in these places, right? So what is the type of an array you are going to build? You know that it is a sequence of pointers to each one of these object memories, right? Ultimately. So now I want to keep an array, and I mean, it could be, yeah, sometimes you need to have a general array and keep specialized object in each one of these memory locations, right? So the different need we have. But I mean, if as far as you know that what is the uh, type of the object you need to keep, then you can create an array of this using this square brackets, right? So you can create an array and actually here there are no spaces probably, right? So yeah. Sorry. Actually, there is this space, but now this is a keyword, right? So yeah, I mean it is an integer and array A and yeah, new integer, right? So integer array. So just try them out. I mean, it is not usual to do this way, but you would usually do this thing and still it would work, but you need to make sure that it is the type, right? So you can also do certain operations like, I mean, this is again a kind of a collection which you are using, collection object. We are considering it as an object, but typically we might, I mean, there are various different ways you could do it. But yeah, again, we would come back to arrays and collections later on. But yeah, so you can still use, this is the first thing you need to know, right? You can bring a string array and give the name, and then you can put equal and put a new string array and then initialize each one of the elements based on that, right? So yeah, this is the array objects scenario. So once you create an array, you cannot change the length, but you can change the elements, right? So you can't grow and shrink a Java array. So this is a typical object. I mean, this is a problem, right? As we said, sometimes it is not flexible enough for us to use, right? This is why the arrays are there for a certain reason, but yeah, rarely we use them because of various reasons, right? Rather, we would use a certain collection and yeah, do things on that which can be like changed flexibly. But there are two actual, I mean, there are two actual implications of doing this. What could that be? Any suggestions? Major thing is that if it is immutable, that means whenever you are doing a modification, you have to allocate another memory and store certain things, right? But if the memory is fixed and you know exactly where to store and the size of the each one of the elements, right? Then it will be much faster, right? So this is a concern, but I mean, these are executed in, I mean, unless you are much concerned about the execution speed. I mean, these are usually, I mean, for example, for scientific computing, if you are doing a certain like a high, maybe a simulation or number crunching, usually Java is not the first choice to go, right? So, but I mean, yeah, if you want to do that even in Java, you could use some things like this and make it faster. But yeah, mainly the concern in Java is that it should be reliable and it should be flexible to do the programming, and also it could be enterprise level uh, reliable thing, right? So that's the major thing. Okay, so when you put this thing, it also like you can consider something like this, right? Array.length, and yeah, so then you can probe the last element of the array using this kind of syntax, right? So it would work, but yeah. So all right. Then also you can refer to each element like this, right? Usually the arrays are indexed from 0 onwards, right? So yeah, maximum value of an array, if you want to do a search, right? You can write an algorithm like this, right? So essentially this now maybe less than or greater than, right? So how do you know that now if it is now this is an integer array, right? We have defined that this is integer array, so we have defined a comparison greater or less than using the, I mean, in the context of integers, right? So this would be kind of like we are defining the like statically defining the type of variable now, right? So this would work without a problem, right? But if it is a generic thing, then maybe this comparison or greater or less than, it might not work as well. In certain cases, it might, based on the data, it might have a problem, right? So this is why Java, it is made sure that it is statically typed, right? So yeah, a simple algorithm, right? Identify maximum value. So it should be able to get that without explaining. Okay, so couple of different another set of ideas now. What is a static variable and a instant variable and a local variable? So for example, a static variable is that there is only one component is available there, right? Only one of them is available. For example, in the initial program we had, right, we said that there is a I mean now anyway, right? So if you want to do a system out println, right? Here the system, we know that whenever the within the context of this program there is only one system, right? So there can't be more than one system where you can have multiple things printing out in different screens or wherever, right? So essentially this is a kind of statically referred variable, right? So it's a class of things, but again out of that class there is only one element, one object in the entire context, right? So there's one instance, and there is, I mean, it is not an instance per se, it is the class itself, right? out of the class. So you take the out, parameter or property, and out of that you take println method and execute it, right? So this is kind of again a static library where you keep a set of functions which is related to the context, right? But yeah, this is necessary only in a couple of reasons. Let's say you need to keep a count how many objects are there in a certain context, right? Then you might need a variable to keep how many instances of this particular object have been made, right? So in that kind of situation, you will need a static variable. Otherwise, it's mostly about finding inputs and outputs bound applications or contexts, right? You want to do a input or output, you need to know where to communicate, right? It cannot be a random place or a dynamic instance of something, right? It need to be a statically known memory location, right? So this is why it is static, all right? So what are the alternative? What are the typical mainly used variables? So there are things like instance variables and local variables. So what is an instance variable? Instance variable means that out of this particular class, let's say now there is a certain array of students or a collection of students, right? Now for each student, you could have a height, for example, right? So, I mean, there is not a single student which we know that, okay, this is the student and keep it there, but there could be a student class. And out of that, they could have student one, student two, student three, like that, right? So for each instance, you need to have a value kept for each one of these independently, right? Each one of them independently. So this is what the typical instance variables are, right? So there's a class template. We know that it's the student, but actual student one, actual student two, actual student three, those are the instances, right? Then local variables are typically things which we are using if they are coming within a method or a function, and then we only need a variable to keep temporarily some of our values, right? And we can discard it after the function is finished, right? Within that scope, we would consider it as a local variable, right? So it is mostly local variables are also kind of instance variables. Now, how do you differentiate that, right? So that's the idea. Like if you have a object instance which we are passing through to the way, I mean, whatever the method, it has access, but it is not within the system, right? I mean, within the function body, that kind of variables also. I mean, there could be some things like that. We'll talk about the scope of a variable later on. But yeah, so there is a certain relationship between instance variables and essentially scope of the variable, right? Local is a scope, and within that scope, you can have a typical variable, but it could usually be a instance of a certain class as well, right? Maybe even a static variable you can keep, but I mean, yeah, so it can be either local or global or yeah, anyway. So if it is within the body of the function, body of the method, then it's a local variable, right? Okay, here's an example of a static variable, right? So now here there is a private static keyword is there because it is as obviously it is static, right? So it means there is only one of them across all the zebras, right? Now this is defined within the zebra class, right? But if it is defined as static, that means you can instantiate it multiple times. You can have a zebra 1, zebra 2, zebra 3, zebra 4, but this one does not change, right? If you try to change it, it will change across, it would reflect across all the zebras, right? So this is pretty common for all the zebras, right? If you change the definition, of course, then it should also reflect across all the zebras, right? So if it is not changing across the class, then we need to make it a static. Otherwise, let's say there are like, for example, cats, right? They would have different colors, right? Butterflies probably, right? So their skin texture cannot be a static variable because it's unique to each one of the instances, not the entire class of species, right? So yeah, so this is why it is there are different concepts called static and instance variables, right? Yeah, it is common or visible to the block which is it is being shared, right? So I mean, if you build a, let's say you are referring to a variable, you are constructing a static variable within this function, right? Now this is a string, right? This is static also, and it's private within this class. I mean, it is fine, but I mean, now there is another thing I kind of didn't cover yet. What is this class thing, right? So of course there is a skin texture method, right? Method is there, and this is out of the method, right? This is outside the method, the this variable definition, right? So let's say you have put this thing inside the here. What would be, what would that be? Within the method, within the this block, you are putting this particular line of code. Then it's essentially a local variable, right? Local static variable. But would you be able to use it, would it be reflected in other instances of zebras, for example? Now I'm asking some questions which you can actually try out in NetBeans. Write a simple code and see what happens, right? So write this code and instantiate couple of zebra 1, 2, 3 by using the new and construct, right? New keyword and the construct. So then see across different, let's say 3 different zebras, will the skin texture be black and white stripes, right? Then try to move this thing inside here, right? And try to run it. Anyways, so don't get ahead of yourselves. Probably we'll go slowly and we'll understand. Okay. So local variables are essentially known as automatic variables. Essentially, it is within the block, right? So here the skin color is inside here, right? So it does not, once you exit this thing, it won't be reflected anywhere else. But here now there is nothing else, so it is not apparent. But hope you get the idea, right? For example, a dog can have multiple different methods within these brackets, right? Within these curly brackets. So yeah, still it would be valid only for this method. There could be multiple other methods which don't see this skin color variable, right? So changes depend on the parameter being passed, right? So you can do that. Okay, so how do you instantiate an object? We call it instantiation, right? You define the class. So this is the public class. We are defining a complex object known as a dog. Its name is dog and it's a class and it's public. We will talk about the scope later on. But once you define the dog, within the dog class, you have multiple things, right? In a class where there are two things we are defining. What are those? Number one, it would have a set of attributes, right? Set of attributes. Second thing, it would have a collection of methods, a set of methods, right? Attributes and methods. So those two are the parts of a class. Okay. So this class is a kind of a blueprint for building a dog object. It's not an instance, but it's a blueprint, right? So using the blueprint, you can instantiate that particular object, right? Now the main function, it can be written in any type of anywhere you can write a main function. So this is not typically a default thing for every class, but since this is the first class you are prototyping, so you write the main method also somewhere within the same class, right? So it doesn't matter, but yeah, so this would be the entry point wherever this main function is, right? So entry point to the program, but it is within the template, it is fine, right? So anyway, so now here there are one method, this is a method, and this is the an attribute, right? So this is an additional method, but it is a public one and it is a static one, right? So wherever you write this thing, it would, I mean, whatever the class, it would have a different purpose, right? So don't measure the template based on this part, measure the template based on this attribute and this method, right? So then you have one attribute named doggy color and it's a string, right? And also it is initialized to brown, right? Now, also we have a tool. I mean, instead of, as we said, right? Instead of changing or like now there's a template, as we said, right? And within this template, there are methods. So the idea is that whenever there is a dog we want to build, right? After building the instance, we won't go and manipulate its internal data or its internal attributes, right? The attributes are there and it's responsibility of that particular instance and its own class, right? So if you are going to manipulate it by a different class or as a programmer yourself, right? You might tamper things and you might break things, right? So you don't know that particular domain of whatever the thing happening, how its internals are working in the dog class, right? You don't need to know to get the things done for what you need, right? That's the entire idea. Rather, you would delegate, right? You delegate, okay, so I have a color and would you be able to edit for yourself, right? You can ask, essentially you're asking the instance, can you get it changed for me, right? I would like to have it this way, right? That's the mindset we are using here. So this is why you have to, when you want to get something done from a certain object, you are looking at what are the methodologies exposed by this particular class, right? So methods, essentially a set of methods available, and how can I use them to get things done which I want to get done, right? So it does not directly deal with the attributes. We are dealing with the methods, right? So if it is impossible to do, or maybe there are certain constraints, there are certain internal mechanisms it would know about itself, but we don't know when you are using them, right? So then it would be taken care of within this method, right? I mean, maybe I'm not authorized to change that particular attribute, right? But it would then maybe do authentication and see whether it really need to be done, right? And it is safe to do the thing, then it would reflect back and say that, I mean, if there's a concern, it would say that, okay, so I can't do that, right? If it can, it would do the thing, right? And if it is allowed to do, or whoever the person calling it is allowed to do that, right? So now here in this particular case, this particular method is also set to private. What does that mean? Again, it is about scopes, right? So we'll talk about scoping later on. But again, there's a meaning behind that also, right? So I won't go into that at the moment. But anyway, the idea is that now let's look at this public static void main function, right? Within the main function, you see that now there is, of course, we have defined the dog class. So template is there. I mean, what we are trying to do here is get an instance of that particular class. Constructor, that means it would allocate the memory and initialize the variable and get it ready in this pointer or essentially a label, right? So then you can ask, okay, so what is your color, right? So I mean, now here, I mean, this is, as I said, maybe this is not the best practice, right? Now here you are just directly getting the value which was here, right? So it's an attribute, right? What I said was that we usually don't deal with the attributes from the instances of the class. Rather, we would ask, maybe you can write a different additional methodology here. Okay, what is it? I mean, you can say doggy dot uh, get dog color, right? Can write a new method named get dog color and it would return a string, right? So that's the typical way to use it. But again, we'll talk about getting things done rather than probing. Now this is bad practice actually. This is the way of probing inside the doggy object, right? So it's usually not recommended. Okay. So now again, another instance of the dog, same class, right? But here you are setting the color and then you are printing the value. So this again, like you are trying to probe in, but instead of that, you can do doggy to dot get dog color and get string sorry skin color. It would be a better way to go about doing this thing. Okay. But again, like what we were main topic was main variables, no. Main topic was variables. So now what happened to these variables now? This is the variable or the attribute, right? Now here you are not changing the color, so it would be by default brown. But here, when you actually initialize it or instantiate this particular class or this particular variable object, right? Its class was actually brown, right? It is not initialized with a certain color. So it would be brown by default, but then you change the color, right? After that, if you ask it to what is your color, it would essentially give you the updated color, right? So this is the notion of doing object-oriented programming. You are just dealing with different objects rather than changing or like manipulating data, right? But as I said, if it is just a set of libraries of maybe procedural functional libraries, right? You can do something like that, right? You can do something like that. So this is a static method call rather than an object like instance method call, right? Most common in object-oriented programming is instance methods, right? Within the from the out of the instance, we are calling a method there, right? So how do you define a method? Usually method name should be there, number of parameters, right? Then the return value type we need to declare. Otherwise, I mean, it cannot typically in Java, we cannot typically return multiple outputs. Okay. So when the function is called, you can give multiple inputs, but you would get only a single output object of it, right? So maybe it could be a complex object, but still a one of them, right? So one instance. So so that's the nature of it. So if you want more than one output, you would either declare a new object type with two different attributes, for example, then return this particular object, right? So like that you can probe, but yeah, I hope you get the idea, right? Single instance, I mean single instance can be returned, right? So single object instance can be returned. I mean, it could be also a primitive and whatever, but yeah, only one, right? And if you really, and this particular method, when you call it, it generates two different parameters. Let's say the average and the standard deviation, right? Both are generated, right? Then you need to output it back to the whoever the person called this thing, right? Whoever the method, the context. You need to return both of the results. That's not typically possible. You can do that by actually combining those, let's say the mean value and the deviation in a single variable package and return it at once, right? All right. So method definition, something like this is the method definition, right? Should appear within the class definition. So this is what we did here, right? So this method definition is within the class definition here, right? Public class dog is the class definition, is the method definition, right? So methods also can be static or instance. What does that mean? As I said, let's say, I mean, you are asking the class template how many of the instances you have created, right? So whatever the number of instances created, right? If it is an instance variable, every time you are creating a fresh copy of it, it would have the initial value, right? So if you create 5 copies of them, so each one of the instances would have its own initial value. Everybody is independently fresh, right? So it wouldn't know that, okay, how many copies were made unless you keep a static method which is common and reflected across all the instances, right? So this is the number. And how about the method? Methods are useful. I mean, for example, main method, right? It is static so that we know in fact this is the place I should jump into this particular context, right? All right. So yeah, so that's the one thing, right? But another thing is these are probably, I mean, you can, some of them can be compiled at the compile time, you can execute it. So let's say there is a static method, right? Idea is it, I mean, now the question is, can it take inputs, right? Yeah, be careful on that. And yeah, try this out as well. Another note you can take. Try this out. What happens if you write this one and maybe there's a input parameter, right? If there's input parameter, how would this static method behave, right? Now here it says executed at compile time. So just check what happens, right? All right. So instance methods are the majority of it, most common ones, right? So yeah, set dog color. Now this is a one you could use, and I mean you can write multiple methods, right? Get dog color, then it would not have a input, but it would have output, right? Output of maybe string. So what we are telling is that public string get dog color and parentheses curly brackets, then you would return okay, return, and you would put doggy color, right? So that would be a method. We call it as a getter, right? This is called a setter, and we would have a getter as well, right? So yeah, so constructor is a special type of method. Okay, so the idea of the constructor is that this is the one we are calling when you need a new instance, right? Now here you want a dog object and this is the name, and new, then you would call a constructor. The idea is that why we need the constructor is that we can have different types of ways to create the same type of object, right? Sometimes you can have, you can give the color itself in the constructor itself as a parameter and ask, I need a yellow dog, right? It's like asking that, right? So it would instantiate a dog and set its color to yellow, and then only I'll get the dog variable, right? But maybe there could be multiple different requirements of building, constructing these objects, right? So then you can have multiple constructors as well. So you need at least one constructor, no? So this is what we call the default constructor. So default constructor, if it is not written, right? For example, here we don't see a constructor, right? But if it is even not appearing in the source code, it is there. Okay. So it initializes, but it does not do anything. But if you want to modify it, for example, let's say I want to set a default set of parameters at the whenever it is constructed, right? Let's say there are 10 different attributes and you can't set them initially for every time, right? You need to initialize it at the beginning of the program whenever the instantiation is happening, right? So what is the default value for each one of the each one of the attributes in the context. So if you are doing that, then you can initialize here in this method. You explicitly write it, then initialize, right? If you don't want to initialize, you don't need to write it. It would still work, right? It is there, but you are not essentially doing anything, right? You are constructing, you know the type, but yeah, so you're not having anything to do like initialize. Okay, so now the default constructor is there, so we don't need to modify it probably, but if you want to have additional parameters and construct based on those additional parameters, then what you can do is write your own method, but it has a certain specific requirement to be a constructor, right? What is it? How can I understand or identify a method as a constructor? It must have the method name of the class. Okay. Can have multiple parameters, input parameters, but the name must be the same as the class, right? So you can have 2-3 different constructors. Each one of them should have the same name, right? That's the idea. But the parameter combinations could be changed, right? You can initialize it either the color or only the age. In different constructors, you can write like that if necessary, right? All right. So, okay. So I won't bore you with all the loops and whatnot. Essentially loops, how they work, and for example, post increment, pre increment, these things you already know. Then there are 4 stage statements, if else statements, switch statements, break and continue. Uh, so what is break and what is continue? Can somebody tell me the difference? And how do they define? In Python also it should essentially be the same, but for a refresher, let's see. Can you use the chat and tell me what is the break statement and what is a continue statement? Can you skip that? Is it the iteration we are missing, or where do you usually use the continue statement? break is stopping the loop, is it? Or what is the break and what is the continue? Okay. Where do you usually find the continue statement? It essentially skips the remaining, right? Usually continue is found in the control structures like switch statements, right? Of course, in for also there could be multiple things, but yeah. So in a switch case statement or if else structure, maybe if else structure it won't work, but in a switch case statements, right? So there are multiple cases and you need to avoid going through everything. Then you need to, once the condition is satisfied, you essentially go to the end of the switch case structure and then you go for whatever the, I mean, downstream tasks, right? Now, what happens in a for loop without a continue, I mean, without a switch case statement, what will happen in a continue word, right? So you can check it, right? Try it out. What if you write this in outside the control structure? There is no for loop and there is no switch case statement. The plain whatever the main function, you write a continue and can see what happens, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense, but just see what happens, right? So usually it should be placed within a control structure. Right? Yeah, so break is going to exit the loop if it is in the loop, but continue would just move to the end and loop back, right? This keeps remaining. Okay. All right. Yeah, if there's kind of control structures are there, right? So if there's structures could be, I mean, more complex, right? So it could have condition 1, 2, 3 like that. I hope you have done things like this before as well. So I'm not going into details. But what is the difference between a switch case statement and a if else statement? There are unique niche requirements of having a switch case statement instead of a for loop. Sorry, if else statement structure. So here's a switch case statement, right? Here, if you don't put the break, what will happen? It will essentially go through to the next one, right? So if you don't yeah, it easy to implement condition, kind of, yes, right? So if you go, let's say we don't have the break statement, would it, I mean, what is the difference? It would essentially execute throughout, probably. If the, I mean, it could check still, I mean, now this is a case value expression. So again, try it out, right? So if you have a break statement and without break statement, it would either go here or what happened with the default, for example, right? Now here you can have actually multiple cases which is complying with the same value. It's not very obvious here, but yeah. It is a range, for example, right? Anyway, so yeah, so you give some exercises, try them out, and let's see how. Yeah, we have to do it practically, otherwise, yeah, that intricacies you won't understand. Okay, so duration and scope of the identifiers is the next topic. So duration and scope. So a lengthy set of details here, but all right. So I think scope we will talk later on during the next session, but yeah, you can read through. I think the slides are made available. So during the scope, duration and scope. Duration is typically like, as I said, whenever there is an instance of the object, right? It would be initialized and it would have, it would keep in the memory. And whenever it is not being used anymore, it is not referenced anymore, right? It would be discarded and it would be collected as garbage and it would not be there, right? So that we can free up the room for new variables, right? So yeah, so how do you do that? When do you discard a certain variable, right? And also what is the scope means that sometimes when there are variables, there are, as I said, right, the attributes are supposed to be kept private, right, for that particular object class, so that the external outsiders of that class should not be able to tamper with what is internal to that particular object, right? Sometimes it is the object, sometimes it is the instance, sometimes it is the local variable, right? So there are different scopes. But even beyond that, we have other scopes like maybe within the package, right? Sometimes it is within the package, sometimes it is public, right? It means anybody can see the object, maybe sometimes even edit the object, right? So, or even methods. Certain methods are only supposed to be used within the class, so that they would be knowing that, okay, so this method is there, but if you expose this to the outside, then somebody would use it in a unintended manner, right? How to use it? How to use it, that particular method? If only the internal insiders knows how to use that method properly, right? Then you would keep it as private method, right? Similarly, there are certain services you are providing to the outside entities as well. So those would be exposed as public methods, right? So behaviors also, right? So, I mean, methods are also known as behaviors, right? So they are expressing certain behaviors. So there are internal behaviors and there are also externally expressed behaviors, right? Again, a set of naming conventions. So again, these are conventions, but it would make your life easier when you know them. So yeah, follow it through and adhere to them. Okay. I won't go into details. It's boring. So in Java, there are this many keywords, right? So you might not use some of them within the course, but yeah, so yeah, most of it you can go and search what those are, right? So most of them you know already, but there are some new words, for example, abstract. We will talk about them in interfaces and so on, but yeah, some of them you might not use, but you would still understand. Volatile, for example, you have already done in Python as well, right? So yeah, these words, knowing them is one thing is that you can't use them as variable names, right? So that's the problem. That's a concern. Other thing is you would learn some functionality or maybe add something to your basket of tools or tricks to perform when you are writing programs, right? If you know these keywords, right? So we'll learn specifically about abstract implements, for example, enums, like kind of data structures thing, right? Finally, classes, of course, you know, try catch stage, try and catch, you would learn, right? Throws, you will learn, right? Synchronized, maybe, yeah. So those would be. There are some terms like that we would be discussing in the course. Okay, so yeah, if you know these things, how to use them properly, then essentially you know the uh, like basics of the language, right? Comprehensively. Yeah. Okay, so I think I have run out of time, but yeah, so I mean, for next Wednesday, right? So again, I would go through I took time to actually explain some of these things, but the object-oriented programming is the actual first idea. So I will go through that again on next Wednesday. Okay. So, and also we will go through the first practical session. I have already enabled the lab sheet, so it should be a much simpler one. But I would give a certain exercise as well for you to run and submit for the next week. Okay. So yeah, thank you for listening in and okay. So if so, a couple of questions probably or maybe comments. In if else can compare with the range of values, but not with switch case. So okay, yeah. So that's a correct thing. Probably I have confused it for you. So here you can write the expression, right? So these are, for example, in the value becoming this or this, but it could be a range, right? For the project. Okay, so okay, so yeah, this one let's try out. Okay, so next week we will try it out while the practical session, and you would learn. Okay. So today I won't give you a spot quiz, right? So we will do a one later on. So projects are interesting thing. So yeah, I would ask you to suggest you to do a brainstorming. Okay, so go and discuss among yourselves and identify a certain unique situation where you can introduce a kind of um, deployable software where you can actually use a software, right? But there could be I mean, it should be a situation where multiple people are involved and you need to get things done in a streamlined manner, or there is a certain business process, right? Usually we talk in industrial or enterprise applications, there is a business process we are trying to automate, right? BPO. So business process automation is the major requirement of having a project, right? There is a certain manual business process which is slow and not functioning well and not efficient. So we are trying to automate it by having a software, right, or a system. So if you can maybe identify something which is maybe in a public domain, right? So in a public process, let's say there are like various processes in the university, right? Or there are various processes in the country, right? So which can be automated, right? So which can be made efficient by a certain manner, right? So maybe a government service, right? Or maybe a so I mean the idea first thing of doing a project is understanding the business process, analyze the business, right? Then maybe it's a I mean typically what people do is like let's say a e-commerce website, right? So website is there, but it's not the only thing, right? Website represents a single facade of a entire business process, right? Let's say a ticket booking system, right? So these kind of things are maybe a park management system, right? Whatever the thing. So there are multiple people involved and there is a certain business process involved, right? So if you can identify those and actually, I would like to see when you actually do a project, it evolves, right? It is growing. It is supposed to grow, right? And maybe sustain its own, obtain and sustain its own life cycle, right? But as a community product or a project. You can do that, that would be a fascinating thing to have. And don't underestimate yourselves. You can build something like that, right? So don't just do it for the sake of the project. Do it for as a contribution. You can probably say that, okay, so you have built this thing and it is live and probably other people are also developing it and so on, right? So you can go and refer to some of the projects your seniors have done. They are probably not perfect, but still they have done and learned a lot, right? So if you come up with idea which is relevant to the current context, and all of us probably ideally all of the students which you will be developing this thing with, and whatever the other stakeholders involved, right? So all of these people would benefit if you build something good, right? So nowadays, I mean, coding is actually pretty fast, right? You can use AI tools, generative AI and whatnot. So again, how to understand is important, and how to interpret things, and then how to come up with the business process actually which you need to build, right? So this is the major part of software engineering nowadays, right? How do you analyze the requirement, and if there's a change requirement, how do you change it, and how to re-engineer the business process in a way that it is acceptable to everybody, so that you can automate it, right? So this part, if you can come up with the project proposal, we would be happy to accept it, right? So but again, there is a different, again, a layer to it. We will explain it maybe next week or somewhere later on. So there are different layers of actually doing a project, right? Owning a project is one thing, developing it is one thing, testing and validating and making sure that it is what it was supposed to build is another thing. So there are multiple different aspects you should look at in a project. So yeah, all right, okay. All right, another question. Enrollments. I don't know, maybe there is a upper limit for how many can be registered. So I think for electrical, they should be able to, anyway, it's compulsory for them. For electronics, there is I think it should be an elective or like optional module for you, right? So I don't know, the drop period is still ongoing, right? We only started the semester this Monday, no? So it should be possible. But if it is also not from electrical, I'm not quite sure whether other students as a faculty elective it is being offered. You might have to check with maybe undergraduate studies division. Just drop me an email or WhatsApp message and we can see specific situation, what happened. For the weekly physical lab, no, we don't have the weekly physical lab. It is also online. The lab is made available to you if you want to sit down and do the work there. But the lab allocated physical venue is allocated for that task. But you don't need to come to the lab. Mainly, you have to come to the lab for the mid-semester exam. And for that day, you will be definitely should be there at the lab. Otherwise, it is mainly you can do it asynchronously as well. Okay. Asynchronous in the sense there will be some sport quizzes, but the practical session also, I know some of you are already expert programmers and know Java much at expert level. So yeah, so you can focus on the higher part of it, the software engineering part of it as well, right? So come up with ideas. You would have, I mean, yeah, so there would be maybe 4 different, now here there are 120, right? So maybe 4 or 5 different companies or different large groups. We call them companies, right? So one company would come up with the idea, the other company, I mean, each company has to come up with their own idea. Then you are not actually building your own idea. You have to very clearly document and declare this is what we need to get built, right? That's the first task of the software engineering process. Second task is, as a software company, you would be getting a functional requirement, a software requirement specification, and you would build it for somebody else, right? So then you are stepping into the shoes of a developer or maybe a software development company, right? So then you would develop it. The idea in this context is that you would not build your own product, you would build somebody else's product, right? So you get the feeling that, okay, so you are building something which you also don't want to have. Maybe it is something a commercial I mean, or maybe a professional commitment rather than it's your own product, right? Then you have to do the validation and compare these two and say that, okay, this company wanted this and this company built it. And I'm as my third party responsibility is to check whether this thing has been met, right? So all of these three roles you would be playing in the later stages. Okay. So if you are currently now, if you are familiar with the existing whatever the tools and maybe the object-oriented programming is nothing for you, go ahead and work on actually developing a set of skills. For example, code management, source code management, right? And in the group, you would have 20 people under you probably, right? If you are going to lead the team. So there would be, let's say, 5 different teams who are working on, let's say, 4 people up to 5 groups, right? 4 into 5, 20 people. Now, how would you break down the workload of a large scale project, right? We are developing a product now, right? It is a product which has which you are supposed to allocate 20 people programming work for, let's say, 3 or 4 different weeks, right? Within 4 weeks, given 20 people, how can you get this product of maybe, I don't know, how many lines of code, right? It's a large product, right? How can you get it built? That's the challenge, right? So that's the challenge. How do you modularize it? How do you make sure that there are different modules which you can allocate to different parts of the groups or different teams of the company and different individuals of the company, so then they can build it independently and then you can combine them together, right? Because if you wait until everything is I mean, one component is built, then only you are moving to the next one. Sequentially, it would take a long time, right? In software industry, you can't wait long time. You have to do it today, right? So within the 2 weeks, how can you get most of the majority of the code developed? The key is to do the modularization, right? Then you put them back together, integrate, right? Then you test it whether its functionalities have been met. Then you can deploy it probably, right? That's the hope. So that process is the one which you need to get yourself familiarized with, right? All right. So look into those things as well. All right. Thank you. I'd stop it here. So see you on Wednesday at 3:15 through the same Zoom link. Okay. So make sure that you have NetBeans installed and ready for things. And yeah. All right. Okay. Have a good evening. Bye.